In the year 1415, the Portuguese crown embarked on a bold and irreversible course that would change not only its own destiny, but that of the world. On the 21st of August, under the blazing North African sun, the banners of King João I of Portugal were raised above the city of Ceuta, a fortified Muslim port on the southern side of the Strait of Gibraltar. This single act, the conquest of Ceuta, would come to be remembered as the symbolic beginning of the Portuguese Empire, the first European overseas empire of the modern age. Ceuta was more than a city. It was a gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, a hub of commerce where goods from across Africa and the Islamic world were exchanged. Gold from West Africa, ivory, spices, silks, and crucially, enslaved people all flowed through its markets. The Portuguese crown, long hemmed in on the Iberian Peninsula by its powerful neighbor Castile, sought new horizons. The conquest of Ceuta gave Portugal both prestige and a foothold in Africa. The king's sons, especially the young Prince Henrique, later immortalized as Henry the Navigator, would transform this victory into the foundation of a new world order. Born in 1394, Prince Henry was a child of Portugal's emerging ambitions. After Ceuta, he established himself not in the capital Lisbon, but on the southwestern promontory of Sagres, overlooking the Atlantic. Tradition holds that he created a kind of school of navigation, gathering together sailors, cartographers, astronomers, and shipwrights. While historians debate how formal this school was, what cannot be doubted is Henry's role in directing and financing expeditions southward along the African coast. Portugal, a small kingdom of barely 1 million people, lacked the resources of larger states. But it had one advantage: the sea. Its Atlantic coastline encouraged maritime culture, and Portuguese shipbuilders refined a vessel uniquely suited to exploration, the caravel. Unlike the bulky ships of the Mediterranean, caravels were light, maneuverable, and capable of sailing into the wind. This technical leap gave Portugal the ability to probe coastlines and return against contrary winds. By the early 15th century, Portuguese ships had already ventured further south than any of their European counterparts. In 1419, sailors João Goncalves Zarco and Tristão Vaz Teixeira reached the island of Madeira, which was soon colonized. By 1427, explorers reached the Azores, another volcanic archipelago deep in the Atlantic. Both Madeira and the Azores were settled with Portuguese colonists and cultivated with crops, especially sugarcane, a commodity whose cultivation and labor demands would shape the empire's future. These islands became laboratories of empire. Their soils were worked by enslaved Africans brought from the mainland, foreshadowing the transatlantic slave system that Portugal would pioneer. From the 1440s, the Portuguese extended their reach along the West African coast, exploring further south each year. In 1441, two captains under Prince Henry captured a group of Africans near Cape Blanc, marking the beginning of Portugal's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Within a decade, enslaved men, women, and children were being transported to Portugal in significant numbers. By 1455, enslaved Africans made up nearly 10% of the population of Lisbon. In 1456, Portuguese sailors discovered the Cape Verde Islands, which, like Madeira and the Azores, were colonized and transformed into plantation economies reliant on slave labor. These Atlantic outposts not only provided bases for further voyages, but also became nodes in the expanding network of trade and exploitation. At the same time, Portuguese merchants sought gold. They established trade posts along the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, bringing back the precious metal that would fuel their kingdom's economy and allow Lisbon to mint the celebrated Cruzado coin. Portugal's growing wealth and prestige were now tied to its control of maritime trade routes. The Portuguese crown sought not only wealth but legitimacy. In a deeply Christian Europe, expansion was framed as part of a holy mission. The papacy played a crucial role. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the bull Dum Diversas, granting Portugal the right to subdue and enslave Saracens, pagans, and other unbelievers. 3 years later, in 1455, the bull Romanus Pontifex confirmed Portugal's monopoly over newly discovered lands south of Cape Bojador and sanctioned the slave trade. These papal decrees gave Portugal the moral justification it sought, embedding its empire in the language of crusade and conversion. But behind the rhetoric lay economic ambition, religion and commerce, piety and profit. These threads would remain interwoven throughout Portugal's imperial history. By the later decades of the 15th century, Portuguese ambitions had outgrown the Atlantic islands and West Africa. The ultimate goal was clear: India, and with it, the spice trade. For centuries, spices like pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves had been brought to Europe via overland routes dominated by Islamic and Venetian merchants. These goods commanded astronomical prices. If Portugal could reach India by sea, it would bypass the middlemen and command the profits. The key was to round the southern tip of Africa. For decades, sailors feared the unknown waters beyond the bulge of West Africa. But in 1487, King João II commissioned Bartolomé Dias to attempt the passage. In 1488, Dias's ships battled fierce storms off the southernmost coast of Africa. Blown off course, they found themselves sailing eastward into waters they had never known. Turning north, Dias realized he had passed the tip of the continent. He named it the Cape of Storms, Cabo das Tormentas. But when he returned to Lisbon, the king, recognizing the significance of the discovery, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, for it proved the sea route to Asia was open. Dias's voyage marked a turning point in world history. For the first time, Europeans had physically proven that Africa could be rounded and Asia could be reached by sea. Within a decade, Vasco da Gama would complete the journey to India, and Portugal's empire would expand across oceans. By the end of this first phase, 1415 to 1488, Portugal had transformed itself. In less than a century, it had seized Ceuta, 1415, establishing Europe's first permanent overseas colony, discovered and colonized Madeira, 1419, the Azores, 1427, and Cape Verde, 1456. Initiated the Atlantic slave trade, 1440s onwards. Established trade networks along the West African coast. Secured papal bulls granting legitimacy and a monopoly over exploration. Reached the southern tip of Africa with Bartolomé Dias, 1488. Portugal was no longer a peripheral kingdom on Europe's edge. It had become a maritime pioneer, carving out a global vision before any other European state. Its ships now ranged farther than any before. Its wealth grew with every voyage, and its ambitions stretched across the horizon. The empire had been born, not yet at its zenith, but already reshaping the world. From Ceuta to the Cape of Good Hope, from the sugar fields of Madeira to the slave markets of Lisbon, Portugal had set in motion forces that would transform continents and peoples alike. And as the 15th century closed, the path to Asia and to a truly global empire lay open before them. By the late 15th century, Portugal had proven itself a master of the Atlantic. Its caravels had charted the coasts of West Africa. The Azores and Madeira were settled and cultivated, and explorers had rounded the southern tip of Africa. Yet the true prize, the lands of India and the East, the source of spices that had driven European commerce for centuries, remained tantalizingly out of reach. The Portuguese crown, under King Manuel I, saw in the Indian Ocean not just wealth, but a chance to establish the first truly global maritime empire. The vision was clear: to bypass the Venetian and Arab-controlled overland routes and sail directly to the markets of Asia. This undertaking would require courage, innovation, and a daring navigator, someone capable of bridging the uncharted oceans. That man was Vasco da Gama. Born around 1460 in Sines, Portugal, a skilled sailor shaped by decades of Portuguese exploration and the bold precedent set by Bartolomeu Dias. In 1497, the Portuguese crown meticulously prepared a fleet for a journey unlike any before. King Manuel I provided 4 ships, the São Gabriel, the São Rafael, a supply ship named Barrio, and a storage vessel. Each was fitted for long ocean travel, reinforced against storms, and stocked with provisions for months at sea. The crew included a mix of seasoned sailors, navigators, pilots, and a few priests, men prepared to face the unknown and to bear witness to Portugal's Christian mission overseas. Prince Henry's legacy was evident in every detail. The Portuguese had perfected navigational techniques, including astrolabes, cross staffs, and portolan charts, and had mastered the winds of the Atlantic. They had learned the volta do mar, the wind and current pattern that allowed ships to return home despite prevailing contrary winds. On July 8, 1497, Vasco da Gama's fleet departed Lisbon. The city, still recovering from the great expansion under King João II and the building of new shipyards, had become a hub of maritime activity. Crowds lined the Tagus River to watch the ships vanish into the horizon. Families, aware of the dangers, wept. Some sailors would not return for years, and many would never see their homeland again. The fleet sailed south along the coast of Africa, stopping at the Madeira Islands and Cape Verde for provisions, before following the well-known routes along the West African coast. But beyond Cape Verde, the ocean became an immense and lonely expanse. Storms battered the ships, supplies ran low, and uncertainty gnawed at the men. Many feared the edge of the world, haunted by legends of sea monsters, boiling waters, or the fiery cliffs of a flat earth. Yet da Gama's leadership kept the men focused and disciplined, guiding them toward the unknown with a combination of charisma, authority, and experience. By late November 1497, the fleet approached the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa that Bartolomeu Dias had rounded less than a decade earlier. These waters were treacherous. High winds and enormous waves battered the ships, and hidden reefs threatened to tear them apart. Here, Portuguese knowledge of the currents and careful navigation proved crucial. They followed Dias' route, demonstrating that prior exploration was not a curiosity, but the foundation for a truly global empire. Crossing the Indian Ocean required understanding the monsoon winds, a crucial factor that had confounded European sailors for centuries. By timing their journey correctly, da Gama ensured the fleet could ride the seasonal winds eastward toward India. After nearly 10 months at sea, on May 20th, 1498, Vasco da Gama arrived at Calicut, modern-day Kozhikode, on the Malabar coast of India. For Europe, this was nothing less than a revelation. The city, already a hub of spice trade, was filled with merchants from Arabia, Persia, China, and Africa. Ships laden with pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cardamom crowded the harbor, their sails like a forest on the waves. Da Gama's arrival was initially met with curiosity, suspicion, and caution by the local Zamarin, the ruler of Calicut. He observed these strange foreigners with pale skin, Portuguese language phrases, and unfamiliar gifts, cloth, beads, and trinkets. The Portuguese were careful to offer items that would impress and show respect, but the negotiations were difficult. Cultural misunderstandings, mistranslations, and differing trade practices made the early encounters tense. Yet, despite these challenges, Portugal had achieved what no European power had before: direct access to the Indian spice markets, bypassing intermediaries and Muslim-controlled trade routes across the Middle East. This was a turning point, not only for Portugal, but for global commerce. European nations would never look at the oceans the same way again. Vasco da Gama's mission did not end with reaching India. Returning home was equally perilous. The monsoon winds had to be carefully navigated, and scurvy, disease, and famine threatened the fleet. On the return journey, only 2 of the original 4 ships made it safely back to Lisbon in July 1499. Yet the cargo of spices and the reports of India's wealth ensured Portugal's status as a rising global power. King Manuel I received da Gama as a hero. The journey's success opened the doors to an era of Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, setting the stage for the empire's expansion into East Africa, the Persian Gulf, and Asia. While Vasco da Gama's voyage opened the eastern trade route, fate would redirect another Portuguese navigator to the west. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral was commissioned to follow da Gama's path to India. Commanding 13 ships, Cabral sailed southwest, ostensibly to catch favorable winds around Africa. However, strong Atlantic currents pushed his fleet far west, and on April 22, 1500, they sighted land on the eastern coast of South America, modern-day Brazil. Cabral claimed the territory for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas, which had divided newly discovered lands outside Europe between Portugal and Spain along a meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. While Cabral's landing was initially accidental, it marked the first European claim on South American soil for Portugal. The fertile forests and rivers of Brazil would, in time, become a linchpin of Portugal's empire, providing sugar, gold, and later, coffee for European markets. By 1500, the Portuguese Empire had already spanned 2 oceans, from the coasts of Africa to the markets of India, and now to the forests of Brazil. Portugal had demonstrated that a small kingdom could wield influence far beyond its borders. The implications were profound. Europe now had a direct maritime route to Asia, fundamentally changing global trade. Colonization and exploitation of the Americas had begun centuries before most other European powers. The Atlantic slave trade would intensify as Portuguese holdings expanded, linking Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a network of commerce, labor, and human suffering. Portugal's achievements were the product of vision, technology, and audacity. The caravels, navigational knowledge, and royal sponsorship created the conditions for empire. But it was also an empire of extremes, magnificent in scope, yet built on the conquest, subjugation, and displacement of countless peoples. The years 1498 to 1500 were more than milestones. They were the birth pangs of globalization. In less than 3 years, Portuguese ships had connected Europe directly to the riches of India and discovered a new world across the Atlantic. These voyages would pave the way for forts in Mozambique, Goa, Malacca, and eventually Macau, and for centuries of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that reshaped the known world. For Portugal, a kingdom of 1 million souls on the edge of Europe, the ocean was no longer a boundary. It was the stage upon which it would perform a drama of conquest, trade, and empire. By 1500, the Portuguese had proven that the seas belonged to the daring and that an empire could be built not on land alone, but on the waves of the world's oceans. The stage was now set for the golden age of the Portuguese Empire, a period of expansion, conquest, and cultural encounters that would see Portugal become the first truly global power in history. But that story, with its triumphs and tragedies, lies ahead in the decades that follow. The turn of the 16th century marked the dawn of Portugal's first true era of maritime domination. The daring expeditions of Vasco da Gama and Pedro Álvares Cabral had proven the feasibility of global navigation, and the Kingdom of Portugal, small, distant, and often underestimated by its European neighbors, now stood on the brink of something unprecedented: the creation of a global empire spanning continents and oceans. By 1500, the Portuguese had not only discovered a sea route to India, but also claimed the eastern coast of South America, which would come to be known as Brazil. These achievements were not merely geographical. They represented the expansion of political power, economic reach, and cultural influence, establishing Portugal as the first truly global maritime power. In 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque, a brilliant military strategist and administrator, captured the city of Goa on the western coast of India. Goa would serve as the capital of the Estado de India, the Portuguese administrative and trading hub in the east. Albuquerque's vision was as much about control as conquest. He understood that controlling key ports and straits would allow Portugal to dominate trade routes, rather than simply collecting taxes from the merchants who passed through them. Albuquerque's campaigns were calculated. In 1511, he seized Malacca, a thriving commercial entrepot in the Malay Peninsula. Malacca's strategic location at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca allowed the Portuguese to dominate trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Albuquerque famously described his vision: "We will choke the commerce of the world at its source." By controlling Malacca, Portugal could influence the flow of spices, silks, porcelain, and precious metals, redirecting wealth to Lisbon. In 1515, the fortress of Hormuz was established at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. From this position, Portugal could regulate the trade of pearls, dates, and incense, further extending its network of influence. Each fortress, each port, was not merely a military installation. It was a node in a web of global commerce, linking Africa, the Middle East, India, and eventually East Asia. Portugal's ambitions were not limited to the Indian Ocean. By 1557, the crown secured the right to establish a trading post in Macau, on the southern coast of China. The city became Portugal's gateway to the Chinese market, allowing the exchange of European goods for Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea. Macau exemplified Portugal's ability to adapt to different cultural and political environments. Unlike violent conquest in India, the Portuguese approach in China. By the 1570s, Portuguese sailors had even reached Japan, establishing a foothold in Nagasaki. The Portuguese introduced firearms, new shipbuilding techniques, and Christianity. This period marked the beginning of a truly global network. Africa, Asia, and the Americas were now connected by Portuguese ships, and Lisbon had become the hub of an empire that spanned 4 continents. While Portugal's Eastern Empire expanded, Brazil, claimed in 1500, was beginning to emerge as its most economically significant colony. Early Portuguese settlers focused on sugar cultivation, which demanded large-scale labor and capital. By the mid-16th century, the Portuguese had imported thousands of enslaved Africans to work the plantations, creating the foundation for the transatlantic slave system that would persist for centuries. The sugar trade transformed Brazil's coastal regions, particularly in Pernambuco and Bahia, into centers of wealth and settlement. Portuguese colonists faced resistance from indigenous populations, but over time, the combination of European technology, military strategy, and disease decimated local societies. By the 1570s, Brazil had become not just a distant claim, but a central pillar of the Portuguese Empire, supplying both wealth and resources essential for the maintenance of their Asian and African holdings. The success of Portugal's empire rested as much on innovation as on ambition. Portuguese shipwrights perfected the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable ship capable of long voyages across open oceans. Coupled with navigational advancements, the astrolabe, quadrant, and cross staff, along with improved charts and the mastery of wind patterns, Portuguese sailors could travel further and with greater precision than any of their European rivals. Maps created in Lisbon during this period, the Cantino Planisphere, 1502, being a famous example, demonstrated the scope of Portuguese knowledge. Africa's west coast, the route to India, and even parts of Brazil were charted with remarkable accuracy. Knowledge was power, and Portugal's ability to gather, preserve, and utilize maritime intelligence allowed a tiny kingdom to punch far above its weight on the global stage. The Portuguese Empire was also a civilizing mission, at least as it was justified in contemporary European eyes. Catholicism was inseparable from the empire. Missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, accompanied expeditions seeking to convert local populations. Goa, Malacca, and Macau became centers of Christian learning and worship. Churches, schools, and hospitals were constructed alongside forts and warehouses. Yet the empire's cultural exchange was complex. Portuguese traders learned from local societies, adopting new crops, shipbuilding techniques, and even diplomatic protocols. In Japan, for example, Portuguese firearms were adopted into local armies, and Portuguese words entered the Japanese language. The empire was not merely an imposition. It was a network of interaction, exploitation, and adaptation. By the 1570s, the Portuguese Empire had created a global trading network unparalleled in the world. Lisbon became the repository of spices, silks, gold, ivory, and other treasures from distant lands. The crown taxed commerce heavily, funding further exploration and military campaigns. Yet wealth brought challenges. Maintaining forts in distant lands, paying troops, and securing shipping routes required constant vigilance. Pirates, rival European powers, and local resistance threatened Portuguese interests. Despite these challenges, Portugal's global monopoly on key ports allowed it to maintain dominance, and the empire's wealth supported the arts, architecture, and literature, epitomized by Luís de Camões the Lusíads, 1572. In this epic, the heroism of Portuguese sailors and the grandeur of their voyages are immortalized, offering a narrative that blends adventure, faith, and national pride. No empire stands unchallenged. By the late 16th century, rivals emerged on every front. The Dutch, English, and French began testing Portuguese dominance. Dutch corsairs attacked Malacca, Ceylon, and the Spice Islands. English privateers seized Portuguese vessels along the African coast, and in Brazil, French traders attempted to establish footholds. The empire was vast but fragile. Its successes relied on speed, surprise, and local alliances rather than sheer population or military strength. The Portuguese faced a paradox. Their empire was global but thinly spread. A few thousand men, often outnumbered by local populations, controlled vast territories. Fortresses, diplomacy, and maritime mobility were their tools, but the strain of governing such a dispersed empire would become increasingly apparent in the decades to come. The period from 1500 to 1570 represents the golden age of the Portuguese Empire. In less than 70 years, Portugal had moved from a European kingdom of modest means to a global power connecting Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The foundations of empire, fortified ports, navigational mastery, a monopoly on trade, and cultural influence were firmly established. Yet the empire was still young. Its wealth and power were based on commerce and control of strategic choke points rather than large-scale settlement. This would make it vulnerable in the coming centuries when European rivals became more organized and determined to challenge Portugal's dominance. By the end of this period, the world had changed irrevocably. Portuguese ships sailed from Lisbon to Goa, from Malacca to Nagasaki, and across the Atlantic to Brazil. Spices flowed to Europe, wealth flowed to Lisbon, and knowledge of the world expanded exponentially. Portugal had demonstrated that even a small kingdom could project power globally, not through armies alone, but through vision, technology, and audacity. Yet, beneath the grandeur lay contradictions. The empire relied on enslaved labor, imposed foreign rule over diverse peoples, and faced constant threats from rivals. The narrative of Portuguese mastery of the seas is inseparable from the human cost of empire, a theme that would recur throughout its history. The late 16th century brought a turning point in the history of the Portuguese Empire. The kingdom that had dazzled the world with its navigational feats, global trade networks, and maritime dominance now faced a profound crisis. It was a period defined not only by opportunity, but by dynastic uncertainty, political subordination, and external threat, forces that would reshape the empire and expose its vulnerabilities to emerging European rivals. The seeds of this crisis were sown in 1578 on the sun-scorched plains of Alcácer in northern Morocco. King Sebastian I, a young and ambitious monarch, had long been captivated by crusading ideals and sought to expand Portugal's influence in North Africa. Leading a massive army of around 17,000 men, he attempted to confront the forces of the Moroccan Sultan Abu Abdullah Muhammad II al-Mutawakkil, hoping to achieve a symbolic Christian victory. The expedition ended in catastrophe. King Sebastian's army was annihilated, and the young king himself disappeared in the chaos. His body was never definitively identified. Portugal, already a small kingdom, was now left heirless. Sebastian's great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, assumed the throne in 1578, but he was elderly and childless, serving only as a temporary stopgap. By 1580, Cardinal Henry's death triggered a succession crisis that would have profound consequences for the empire. With Portugal without a clear heir, the Spanish King Philip II of the Habsburg dynasty claimed the throne. He was related to the Portuguese royal family through his mother, Isabella of Portugal, and had both dynastic justification and military power. In 1580, Philip II's forces occupied Lisbon, effectively uniting Portugal and Spain under a single monarch, an arrangement known as the Iberian Union. While Portugal retained its administrative independence, legal system, and colonial structures, the union had immediate and lasting consequences. Portugal was drawn into Spain's global conflicts, particularly against Spain's rivals in Europe, the Dutch, the English, and the French. The crown's wealth, previously devoted to Portuguese initiatives, was now partially redirected to support the Spanish Habsburg Empire, weakening Portugal's autonomy and stretching its resources thin. The Iberian Union exposed Portugal to the ambitions of emerging European maritime powers. The Dutch Republic, in the midst of its revolt against Spanish rule, viewed Portuguese colonies as legitimate targets. They sought to capture strategic ports and disrupt trade routes, both to weaken Spain and to enrich themselves. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, was established, becoming the primary instrument of Dutch imperial expansion in Asia. By the 1610s and 1620s, Dutch forces captured key Portuguese territories in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, Malacca, and the Moluccas, undermining Portugal's control over the lucrative spice trade. Similarly, the English East India Company, chartered in 1600, began to challenge Portuguese dominance along the Indian coast. The empire's naval forces were crucial. Portuguese galleons, armed with heavy cannons, patrolled the Indian Ocean and Atlantic shipping lanes. Their strategy emphasized controlling choke points rather than attempting to occupy vast territories. The empire was, by design, thinly spread but strategically concentrated, a global web reliant on sea power, fortified ports, and intelligence networks. While Portugal maintained its global network, the Iberian Union imposed subtle but significant economic constraints. The empire's profits from the spice trade, sugar, and silver were now partially siphoned to fund Spain's military campaigns in Europe. Meanwhile, Dutch and English competitors, exploiting the Union's vulnerabilities, captured ports, intercepted ships, and challenged monopolies. In India, the Portuguese monopoly on pepper, cloves, and nutmeg was increasingly contested. By the 1620s, Dutch control over Ceylon and the Spice Islands diverted much of the wealth that had previously flowed into Lisbon. In Africa, Dutch and English privateers preyed on Portuguese ships, while local rulers leveraged these rivalries to resist Portuguese authority. The empire's thin human and financial resources were now being stretched across continents and oceans, a vulnerability that would become more pronounced in subsequent decades. Despite political subordination to Spain, Portugal's empire continued to project cultural and religious influence. Catholic missions, particularly Jesuit initiatives, flourished in India, Japan, and Africa. In Goa, schools and churches trained local elites, integrating European knowledge, religion, and administrative techniques. Similarly, in Macau, the Portuguese established a foothold for trade, diplomacy, and Christian missions with China. Portuguese culture, however, became increasingly intertwined with Spanish Habsburg policies. Local governors often balanced loyalty to the crown with the practical demands of managing distant territories. The Iberian Union forced Portugal to navigate a complex web of political allegiance, trade competition, and military necessity, requiring skill, diplomacy, and occasional compromise. The Iberian Union highlighted structural vulnerabilities in Portugal's empire. Its global network depended on a small population and limited military capacity, reinforced by local alliances and maritime technology. The Union exposed these weaknesses to ambitious rivals: the Dutch in Asia and Brazil, the English in India, and the French in Brazil and Africa. Moreover, Portugal's economic model, heavily dependent on monopolies and strategic ports, was ill-suited for long-term defense against well-funded, organized European competitors. Wealth was concentrated, but so was vulnerability. The empire was global in scale, yet fragile in depth. Despite these challenges, Portugal did not capitulate. Local administrators, naval commanders, and merchants adapted creatively. In Brazil, settlers organized militias, fortified towns, and leveraged alliances with indigenous groups to resist Dutch incursions. In Africa and Asia, governors negotiated treaties, paid tribute to local rulers, and fortified harbors. Portuguese sailors developed new navigational strategies to evade pirates and rival fleets, maintaining crucial trade links despite mounting pressure. The empire's resilience lay in its experience, knowledge, and strategic positioning. Its forts, ships, and trade networks were not invincible, but they provided a framework within which Portugal could survive the twin challenges of external competition and internal weakness. By 1640, the strain of the Iberian Union had become unsustainable. Portugal's elites resented subordination to Spain, particularly as the crown's priorities often conflicted with Portuguese interests. The Union had forced Portugal into wars that drained resources and exposed the empire to attack. Dutch control of Asian ports, English incursions, and colonial challenges in Brazil had demonstrated the costs of political dependency. This period set the stage for Portugal's restoration of independence in 1640. While the empire had been challenged and partially eroded, it had also endured. Strategic ports remained. Brazil remained under Portuguese control, and overseas networks, though contested, continued to generate wealth. The Iberian Union was a test of the empire's resilience, a trial that would shape Portugal's subsequent strategies in defense, trade, and diplomacy. The years 1580 to 1640 reveal the dual nature of Portugal's early global empire, its remarkable reach and fragility. The Iberian Union connected Portugal to one of the most powerful European states, yet also entangled it in conflicts it could barely sustain. Portuguese administrators and sailors proved resourceful, but the empire's dependence on small numbers, fortified ports, and maritime logistics was laid bare. The challenge from the Dutch, English, and French demonstrated that technological and navigational prowess alone could not guarantee uncontested control. Strategic foresight, diplomatic skill, and flexible governance were equally crucial. Portugal had built a global network, but now it faced competitors who would not be content with a peripheral role in the new maritime world. The year 1640 marked a decisive turning point in Portuguese history. After 60 years under the Iberian Union, Portugal seized the opportunity to reclaim its sovereignty. The Restoration War had begun, and with it, the kingdom embarked on a path that would redefine the empire's priorities, focusing on consolidating its most valuable possession, Brazil. This period was characterized by resilience, strategic recalibration, and the transformation of the Atlantic colony into the cornerstone of Portugal's wealth and global influence. In December 1640, a nationalist movement orchestrated by Portuguese nobility staged a coup in Lisbon, effectively ending Spanish dominance. John IV, Duke of Braganza, was proclaimed king, inaugurating the House of Braganza. The Restoration War against Spain lasted for over 2 decades, marked by sporadic battles, sieges, and naval skirmishes. Portugal's success relied on diplomacy, military ingenuity, and strategic alliances, particularly with France, the Netherlands, and England, which were eager to weaken Habsburg Spain. The restoration of independence had immediate implications for the empire. Portuguese governors and military commanders now had the autonomy to prioritize colonial defense and administration without interference from Madrid. This allowed Portugal to refocus on Brazil, which had survived Dutch incursions in the northeast, and on its African territories, which provided enslaved labor essential for the sugar economy. By the mid-17th century, Brazil had evolved from a peripheral colony to Portugal's crown jewel. The northeast, particularly Pernambuco and Bahia, had been the centers of sugar production, and Portuguese settlers had learned to defend these territories against Dutch occupation during the 1630s and 1640s. The expulsion of the Dutch in 1654, following decades of armed resistance and guerrilla campaigns led by settlers, enslaved Africans, and indigenous allies, solidified Portuguese control over the most economically productive regions. The colony's sugar economy was expansive. Plantations produced vast quantities of sugar for export to Europe, where demand continued to rise. This wealth fueled not only the local economy, but also the broader Portuguese Empire, funding naval expeditions, fortifications, and administrative structures. Brazilian cities like Salvador and Recife became bustling hubs of commerce, with ports crowded by Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French ships, reflecting the global significance of the colony. The latter half of the 17th century witnessed a transformation in Brazil's economic landscape. In the 1690s, prospectors discovered gold deposits in Minas Gerais, triggering the Brazilian gold rush. This discovery shifted the center of economic gravity from sugar plantations along the coast to the interior regions of Brazil. Gold mining drew settlers, laborers, and administrators inland, leading to the rapid establishment of towns, roads, and local governance. The gold boom had multiple consequences. Lisbon grew wealthy, financing the crown and sustaining Portuguese influence in Asia and Africa. The empire's dependence on transatlantic shipping increased, connecting Brazil's gold mines to European markets. Enslaved African labor, imported primarily from Angola and the Bight of Benin, remained integral to both mining and agricultural production. By the turn of the 18th century, Brazil had become not only Portugal's most valuable colony, but also a critical engine of global trade, linking the Americas, Europe. In Brazil, the Portuguese benefited from relative isolation. The vast Atlantic coastline, dense forests, and interior highlands made the colony difficult to fully penetrate or challenge. Local resistance, both from indigenous groups and competing European powers, was managed through a combination of military action, alliances, and administrative oversight. Portuguese culture and Catholicism continued to shape Brazil and the empire at large. Jesuit missionaries established schools and missions, often in collaboration with local elites, to convert indigenous populations and integrate them into colonial society. Churches, cathedrals, and monasteries dotted the landscape, symbolizing both spiritual authority and the reach of the Portuguese state. Simultaneously, Brazil became a melting pot of cultures where African, European, and indigenous traditions intersected. Enslaved Africans brought religious practices, music, and agricultural knowledge that profoundly influenced Brazilian society. Portuguese colonial policies encouraged a hierarchical social order, but the colony's diversity created unique cultural blends, reflected in language, religion, and daily life. Despite its economic success, Brazil was not without tension. Enslaved African populations resisted in numerous ways, from labor strikes to outright rebellion. Indigenous communities, though often subdued, resisted land encroachment and cultural imposition. The crown faced logistical challenges in transporting gold, managing taxation, and defending remote settlements. Moreover, competition from rival European powers continued. The Dutch in the Caribbean and northeast Brazil, the French along the Amazon, and English traders along the coast ensured that Portuguese control was never unchallenged. Diplomacy, strategic fortifications, and naval power were essential to maintaining stability and economic prosperity. By the close of the 17th century, Portugal had undergone a strategic rebalance. The Iberian Union was a distant memory, and the empire's focus had shifted decisively to the Atlantic, with Brazil at its center. While trade in Asia remained important, particularly through Goa, Malacca, and Macau, the wealth of Brazil, sugar, gold, and later other commodities now underpinned Portugal's global influence. The empire's thin yet resilient structure allowed Portugal to survive despite its limited population. By concentrating resources on strategically valuable territories, Portugal maintained a presence in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, even as other European powers began to encroach on its holdings. The Restoration era demonstrated Portugal's capacity for recovery and adaptation. Despite decades of Spanish domination and pressure from emerging European rivals, the kingdom reclaimed its sovereignty, consolidated its colonies, and capitalized on the economic potential of Brazil. The foundations laid during this period would define the empire for the next century. Brazil's wealth would sustain Portugal, while forts in Asia and Africa maintained global trade links. Administrators, settlers, and missionaries developed networks that reinforced the empire's reach, even in the face of competition and internal challenges. By 1700, the Portuguese Empire had weathered a period of existential crisis. Its independence restored, its most valuable colony thriving, and its global networks intact, Portugal stood as a resilient, if vulnerable, maritime power. The restoration of independence and the rise of Brazil had not only preserved the empire, but transformed it, creating an economic and strategic foundation that would endure into the 18th century and beyond. The 18th century represents a paradox in the history of the Portuguese Empire. Wealth and fragility intertwined, grandeur shadowed by vulnerability. Portugal, once a pioneering maritime power, now faced a world transformed by European rivals, Enlightenment ideas, and internal challenges. Yet the empire's wealth, much of it derived from Brazil's sugar plantations and gold mines, allowed it to sustain a global presence despite its limitations. This was the era historians call the Golden Age, a period in which Portugal was wealthy beyond imagination but constrained by geography, demography, and political realities. By 1700, Brazil had emerged as the undeniable centerpiece of the Portuguese Empire. The gold rush in Minas Gerais, initiated in the 1690s, expanded throughout the early 18th century. Gold mining towns like Ouro Preto and Vila Rica became bustling centers of administration, commerce, and social life. The crown levied taxes such as the quinto, claiming 1/5 of all extracted gold, which became a critical source of revenue for Lisbon. Beyond gold, sugar remained a dominant economic driver along Brazil's coast. Plantations in Pernambuco and Bahia produced vast quantities for export, reliant on the labor of enslaved Africans imported via Angola and other West African territories. This combination of sugar and gold transformed Brazil from a peripheral colony into a wealth-generating engine, capable of funding the empire's ambitions in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The empire's wealth flowed to Lisbon, Portugal's capital, which by the mid-18th century had become one of Europe's wealthiest cities. Lavish palaces, churches, and public buildings testified to the empire's prosperity. The city was adorned with Baroque architecture, fountains, and squares designed to reflect the grandeur of Portuguese global influence. Yet this wealth also created vulnerability. Lisbon's location on the Lisbon-Cascais fault line meant it was seismically active, and in 1755, disaster struck. On November 1st, All Saints' Day, a massive earthquake, estimated at a magnitude of 8.5 to 9.0, devastated the city. Fires and a subsequent tsunami compounded the destruction, killing tens of thousands and obliterating much of Lisbon's infrastructure. The response to this catastrophe was both remarkable and historically significant. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later the Marquis of Pombal, assumed leadership. He enacted swift measures to restore order, suppress looting, and rebuild the city. Pombal implemented modern urban planning principles, wide streets, earthquake-resistant construction, and efficient bureaucracy, turning Lisbon into a symbol of Enlightenment rationality amid devastation. Yet the earthquake also revealed the fragility of Portugal itself. Wealth concentrated in one city, dependent on distant colonies for sustenance, could be so easily disrupted. Throughout the 18th century, Portugal faced pressures from more powerful neighbors. Its alliance with Britain, formalized in the 1373 Treaty of Windsor, became increasingly critical. British naval support helped Portugal defend its Atlantic trade routes, particularly against Spanish and French privateers. This alliance ensured the survival of Portugal's overseas empire, but came with a cost. Portugal's foreign policy and trade were increasingly intertwined with British interests. The empire's reliance on Brazil also had political implications. Lisbon's power was now dependent on a colony, rather than the other way around. Governors and administrators in Brazil wielded significant influence, and the logistics of transporting gold and sugar across the Atlantic required a highly organized and secure maritime network. Any disruption, whether from European rivals, pirates, or internal unrest, threatened the empire's very stability. The dawn of the 19th century brought unprecedented challenges. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Portugal as part of the larger Napoleonic Wars, seeking to enforce the continental system against Britain. The Portuguese royal family, under Prince Regent João VI, made a remarkable decision. They fled to Brazil, bringing with them the court, administrative apparatus, and nobility. This was the first time a European monarchy ruled from the Americas. The relocation had profound consequences. Rio de Janeiro became the new capital of the Portuguese Empire, transforming the colony's political and social landscape. Infrastructure was developed to accommodate the royal court, including palaces, administrative buildings, and cultural institutions. Brazil's status shifted from colony to co-equal kingdom, symbolically and administratively, under the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves established in 1815. While the royal flight preserved Portuguese sovereignty and continuity, it also underscored the empire's fragility. Portugal's European territory was occupied, communication across the Atlantic was slow, and the survival of the monarchy depended entirely on the colony. The Golden Cage wealth and security tied to distant lands had reached its most extreme expression. The presence of the royal court in Brazil catalyzed social, cultural, and economic changes. Trade restrictions were relaxed, ports were opened to foreign ships, and urban development accelerated in Rio de Janeiro and Salvador. Cultural institutions, including libraries, theaters, The Portuguese Empire's economy during this period illustrates the paradox of the Golden Cage. Wealth flowed abundantly from Brazil, yet Portugal remained demographically small and militarily limited. Naval power, trade monopolies, and fortifications allowed Portugal to maintain global influence, but the empire was vulnerable to disruption. Pirates, European rivals, and internal unrest threatened the very systems that generated its wealth. Moreover, Portugal's wealth was concentrated in elite hands. Nobility, merchants, and crown officials profited enormously, while the majority of the population, particularly enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, remained subject to exploitation. The empire's prosperity was thus both dazzling and morally fraught, reflecting the broader contradictions of early modern imperialism. By the early 1820s, the stage was set for a dramatic transformation. The presence of the royal court in Brazil, the reorganization of trade, and the integration of Brazilian elites into imperial governance created conditions for Brazilian self-confidence and eventual independence. King João VI's return to Lisbon in 1821, following the Napoleonic Wars and the liberal revolutions in Europe, left his son, Pedro, in Brazil. Brazil's population, wealth, and strategic significance meant that any decision by the crown would have far-reaching consequences. By 1822, when Pedro declared Brazil's independence, Portugal lost its greatest colony, ending centuries of dominance in the Americas. This event would transform the empire's structure, forcing a re-evaluation of priorities and signaling the beginning of the empire's slow contraction. The Golden Cage period illustrates the tension between wealth and vulnerability. Portugal was richer and more globally connected than ever before, yet its empire relied on distant colonies for its very survival. Lisbon's grandeur, Brazil's economic might, and the crown's administrative acumen masked structural fragilities: a small population, limited military capacity, and dependence on maritime networks. The 18th century had brought glory, disaster, adaptation, and renewal. The empire had survived natural catastrophes, European wars, and logistical challenges. Yet by the early 19th century, new pressure, revolutionary ideas, Napoleon's expansionism, and the rise of colonial identity in Brazil began to challenge the very foundations of Portuguese imperial power. By 1822, the Golden Cage had reached its limits. Brazil's independence would mark the loss of Portugal's most valuable colony, ending the era in which the empire's wealth could sustain its global ambitions almost unchallenged. The empire's strength had always been tied to its colonies, and now that dependency would force a re-evaluation of what remained in Africa, Asia, and beyond. The 18th century, paradoxically magnificent and precarious, had set the stage for both decline and resilience, highlighting the intricate balance of power, wealth, and vulnerability that defined the Portuguese Empire. The year 1822 marked a profound turning point for the Portuguese Empire. With the independence of Brazil, Portugal had lost its largest and most lucrative colony, ending an era in which Atlantic wealth had underwritten global influence. What remained were scattered territories across Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic islands, holdings that were economically smaller, geographically dispersed, and increasingly vulnerable. The empire that once spanned oceans now faced a new reality: survival amid European rivals, local unrest, and its own economic weakness. The loss of Brazil was both a political and psychological shock. Lisbon, once the beneficiary of vast gold revenues and sugar profits, suddenly faced fiscal collapse. The crown's administration struggled to adapt to diminished income, while the Portuguese economy, heavily dependent on colonial wealth, contracted sharply. Brazil's independence also shifted the balance of Portuguese influence in the Atlantic. No longer a continental power commanding transatlantic trade, Portugal now relied on its African colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé, for both economic resources and labor. Yet these colonies were far less productive and more challenging to govern. Their wealth came primarily from trade in slaves, ivory, and agricultural products, commodities that were increasingly contested by the anti-slavery movements sweeping Europe in the 19th century. Portugal's African territories became the backbone of the empire post-1822. Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau were vital for supplying enslaved labor, while Cape Verde and São Tomé functioned as strategic ports and plantations. Yet the geographic vastness, local resistance, and limited manpower made governance difficult. In Angola, the Portuguese administration faced constant challenges from local kingdoms, including the Kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba. These states negotiated, resisted, and sometimes fought against colonial authorities. Portugal relied heavily on local intermediaries, African elites who acted as traders, soldiers, and administrators. The colony's economy was built on slave exports to Brazil and internal agricultural production, but the loss of Brazil as a primary market destabilized these systems. Mozambique faced similar constraints. The Portuguese controlled only coastal enclaves, while vast inland territories remained under the influence of Swahili and Bantu-speaking polities. The trade in ivory, gold, and enslaved people sustained Portuguese settlements, but logistical difficulties and competition from British traders along the Indian Ocean coast limited profitability. Portuguese forts, garrisons, and trading posts formed a network that was critical for survival, but could not replicate the scale or wealth of Brazil. Portugal's Asian possessions, Goa, Macau, and Timor, remained important for global trade, diplomacy, and missionary activity, yet they were vulnerable and isolated. Goa, the crown jewel of the Estado de India, continued to serve as a hub for trade with India and East Africa. Portuguese merchants exchanged textiles, spices, and precious metals, while Catholic missions sought to maintain religious influence. Macau, on the southern coast of China, became a crucial entrepot linking Europe and Asia. It allowed Portugal to participate in the lucrative China trade, importing silks, porcelain, and tea. Timor, by contrast, was a small, remote outpost, significant mainly for its sandalwood trade. These holdings, while strategically valuable, demanded disproportionate resources relative to their economic return. Administration was thin, defense was difficult, and European rivals such as the Dutch and the British increasingly challenged Portuguese authority. The 19th century brought heightened competition among European powers. Britain, France, and the Netherlands had established formidable global networks, backed by industrializing economies and powerful navies. Portugal, with a population of barely 2 million in Europe and limited industrial capacity, struggled to compete. Its naval forces were outdated, colonial administration was underfunded, and the empire's economic base was narrow. Portugal's dependence on colonial wealth created a cycle of vulnerability. To sustain its global presence, Lisbon had to invest in forts, ships, and administration, yet the colony's income was insufficient to support these expenditures. The empire's financial structure was fragile, relying on taxes from distant territories and trade tariffs that fluctuated with European market conditions. Economic stagnation in Portugal compounded the challenge, limiting domestic investment and infrastructure development. Portugal itself experienced political turbulence in the decades following Brazil's independence. The Liberal Wars, 1828 to 1834, a civil conflict between absolutists supporting King Miguel and liberals supporting Queen Maria II, further weakened the nation and diverted attention from the colonies. During this period, colonial governors often acted autonomously, negotiating with local elites, European traders, and rival powers to maintain stability. Administrative reforms sought to modernize governance, yet these were often uneven and constrained by limited resources. Portugal's military, stretched thin across Europe and its remaining colonies, could not exert the same level of control as in previous centuries. The empire's survival increasingly depended on diplomacy, alliances, and careful negotiation rather than outright military dominance. Slavery remained central to Portugal's African colonies during this period. Enslaved laborers were used in plantations, mines, and trade networks that supplied both Portugal and the remaining colonial markets. However, the 19th century brought growing international pressure to end the transatlantic slave trade. Britain, in particular, exerted diplomatic and naval pressure to suppress Portuguese slaving activities. Portugal signed treaties limiting trade, but enforcement was inconsistent. Smuggling continued, and local African rulers often cooperated with Portuguese traders to maintain economic benefit. This created a tension between imperial economic dependence on slavery and emerging European moral and legal opposition, a tension that foreshadowed the eventual transformation of labor systems in the colonies. Portugal's African and Asian colonies were not passive recipients of imperial rule. In Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Goa, local populations resisted taxation, conscription, and trade monopolies. Strategically, Portugal focused on forts, naval bases, and trade choke points, maintaining the remnants of its global reach. While unable to project power on the scale of Britain or France, Portugal's empire retained enough strategic importance to remain relevant in European diplomacy, particularly through its alliance with Britain. Portugal's remaining empire relied on a small European population, supplemented by enslaved Africans and local laborers. In Africa, European settlers were scarce, often limited to coastal towns and trading posts. Indigenous populations maintained cultural and political autonomy in many regions, negotiating with Portuguese authorities on trade, labor, and military support. Social hierarchies were rigid. European officials and merchants occupied the upper strata, while enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples provided the labor essential to sustaining colonial economies. This social structure, while oppressive, allowed Portugal to maintain control with limited manpower, though at the cost of social tension and potential unrest. The post-Brazil Portuguese Empire was a shadow of its former grandeur, yet it remained globally connected. African and Asian colonies linked Portugal to the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, enabling participation in trade, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. Lisbon, while diminished economically, continued to function as a hub for European diplomacy and cultural exchange. Portugal's survival as an empire depended on adaptation, strategic focus, and alliances. Its network of forts, trading posts, and small but capable naval forces allowed it to remain a player in global politics, even as industrialized powers eclipsed its capabilities. By the 1870s, the Portuguese Empire faced a new challenge: the scramble for Africa. European powers, industrializing rapidly, sought territorial control on the continent. Portugal's claims, particularly in Angola and Mozambique, were tenuous and required diplomatic and sometimes military reinforcement. The empire's survival depended increasingly on international recognition, treaties, and the careful management of limited resources. The loss of Brazil, combined with economic stagnation in Europe and the challenges of maintaining overseas colonies, meant that Portugal's empire was now smaller, more fragile, but still strategically significant. The empire's focus had shifted from expansive conquest to consolidation, survival, and adaptation in a rapidly changing global environment. By the end of the 1870s, Portugal's empire had been reduced to a scattered collection of African, Asian, and Atlantic holdings, significantly diminished from the heights of the 16th and 17th centuries. Its survival was remarkable given demographic, economic, and military limitations. Yet the empire's future would increasingly depend on its ability to navigate European rivalries, colonial pressures, and internal reform, setting the stage for the challenges of the scramble for Africa and early 20th century colonial conflict. The late 19th century presented Portugal with both existential challenges and fleeting opportunities. While Europe industrialized and modernized, Portugal remained a small, relatively underdeveloped nation struggling to maintain control over its scattered empire. Yet the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, and the scramble for Africa offered Portugal a chance to secure its African possessions, particularly Angola and Mozambique, before they could be claimed by emerging powers such as Britain, France, and Germany. This period, spanning the 1880s to the early 20th century, was one of diplomatic maneuvering, nationalistic ambition, and the precarious survival of a once great maritime empire. By the 1880s, European powers had industrialized at an unprecedented pace. Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium were expanding their overseas empires to secure raw materials, markets, and strategic ports. Africa, largely uncolonized by Europeans in the early 19th century, became the prime target for imperial competition. Portugal, with a population of barely 5 million in Europe and limited industrial capacity, faced a daunting task: defend claims to vast African territories without the military or economic means to match larger empires. The empire's reliance on diplomacy and historical precedent became central. Portugal argued that centuries of presence in Angola and Mozambique justified its territorial claims. These claims, however, were often disputed by more powerful neighbors, requiring careful negotiation to maintain recognition under international law. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a turning point in the international regulation of Africa. European powers convened to establish rules for colonization, trade, and territorial claims, codifying principles such as effective occupation and notification to other powers. Portugal attended the conference to secure international recognition for Angola and Mozambique. Portuguese diplomats emphasized the historical longevity of Portuguese presence in coastal settlements, forts, and trading posts. While Portugal lacked the infrastructure to fully administer the interior of its claimed territories, the empire leveraged historical precedent, missionary networks, and treaties with local rulers to assert legal claims. These arguments were largely successful. The Berlin Conference formally recognized Portuguese rights over Angola and Mozambique, albeit contingent on demonstrating effective control, a challenge that would dominate the next decades. Portugal's ambitions extended beyond merely consolidating existing territories. Inspired by nationalistic aspirations and the dream of a transcontinental empire connecting Angola and Mozambique, Lisbon produced the Pink Map, Mapa Cor-de-Rosa, in the 1880s, outlining claims to a continuous swath of land across southern Africa. These ambitions directly conflicted with British interests. Britain sought a corridor linking Cape Colony to Cairo, which ran through the areas claimed by Portugal. Tensions culminated in the ultimatum of January 11, 1890, when Britain demanded that Portugal withdraw its forces from contested territories. Portugal, militarily and economically incapable of resisting, acquiesced. The ultimatum sparked national outrage in Portugal. Public demonstrations, political crises, and anti-monarchist sentiment surged. The event humiliated the monarchy, undermined royal authority, and fueled republican movements. It marked the beginning of a profound political transformation, demonstrating the limits of Portugal's imperial ambitions in the face of stronger industrialized powers. Despite setbacks, Portugal sought to consolidate its remaining African and Asian territories. Angola and Mozambique were organized into provinces with governors, military garrisons, and administrative officials tasked with establishing an effective occupation to satisfy international requirements. Portuguese administrators encouraged settlement, trade, and infrastructure development, though progress was slow due to limited resources and vast territorial distances. In Africa, the colonial economy relied on agriculture, rubber, ivory, and later minerals, while local labor was coerced through taxation, forced labor systems, and continued reliance on African intermediaries. The Portuguese crown promoted settlement by small numbers of European colonists to reinforce claims, though demographic limitations prevented large-scale colonization. In Asia, Goa, Macau, and Timor remained valuable trading hubs. Goa continued to serve as an administrative center for the Estado de India, while Macau facilitated trade with China. Portuguese influence in Asia, though modest compared to British or Dutch empires, remained strategically significant for regional commerce. The humiliation of the British ultimatum, combined with economic stagnation and political mismanagement, accelerated dissatisfaction with the monarchy. Republican sentiment grew among intellectuals, urban elites, and the middle class, who viewed the royal family as ineffective in defending national interests. In the early 20th century, political instability intensified. Governments were frequently overthrown, economic crises persisted, and the monarchy's credibility eroded. By October 5, 1910, the Portuguese monarchy was overthrown and the First Portuguese Republic was declared. The republic promised modernization and reform, but political turmoil persisted, reflecting deeper structural weaknesses exacerbated by the empire's shrinking resources and global marginalization. Portugal's military capabilities during this period were modest. European forces were limited in both number and technology, while colonial garrisons were often isolated and underfunded. The empire relied heavily on naval power to protect trade routes, enforce claims, and respond to internal uprisings. Yet the rise of industrialized naval powers like Britain and France meant that Portugal's fleet could only project limited influence. Defense strategies increasingly focused on strategic outposts and alliances, particularly with Britain, which guaranteed Portugal's global position and territorial integrity. While the empire survived, it was no longer capable of expansive conquest or independent global projection, signaling a shift from ambition to maintenance and survival. Portugal's African colonies relied on a combination of coercion, negotiation, and social stratification to maintain control. Coastal towns were administered directly by Portuguese officials, while the interior often operated under local African authority, with Portuguese oversight. Indigenous groups were incorporated into labor systems, trade networks, or military alliances, yet resistance and rebellion were frequent. Slavery had been largely abolished in Portuguese colonies by the late 19th century, particularly under European pressure, but forced labor systems persisted. Taxation and compulsory work programs provided the labor required for infrastructure, plantations, and resource extraction. The social order remained. Portugal's diplomacy during this era illustrates the empire's adaptive resilience. While it lacked the resources to compete militarily with industrialized empires, careful negotiation and alliances allowed it to maintain legal claims, preserve trade, and survive in a competitive imperial landscape. Economic adaptation became a priority in the post-Pink Map era. Angola and Mozambique were increasingly integrated into global commodity markets, exporting agricultural products, ivory, and minerals. Local economies were reoriented to support colonial administration, trade, and resource extraction. Portugal also leveraged European networks to supplement its limited domestic industrial capacity. British merchants, investors, and shipping companies played a crucial role in maintaining Portuguese trade routes and facilitating economic activity. This dependence on external partners reflected both the limitations and the adaptability of the empire in a competitive global economy. Despite the challenges, Portuguese culture and Catholicism remained integral to colonial identity. Missionary activity continued in Africa and Asia, with Jesuits, Franciscans, and other religious orders educating local populations, promoting Christianity, and integrating colonial subjects into Portuguese cultural frameworks. In urban centers like Luanda, Lourenço Marques, Goa, and Macau, the Portuguese language, architecture, and institutions persisted, maintaining a visible presence of empire even as the political and economic foundations faced ongoing strain. By the early 20th century, Portugal had successfully maintained the core of its empire. While the country had suffered humiliations, economic stagnation, and the loss of Brazil, it had preserved Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé, Goa, Macau, and Timor. The empire, though diminished, remained globally connected, strategically relevant, and capable of sustaining Portuguese influence on multiple continents. Yet this survival came with a cost. The empire's holdings were often expensive to administer, difficult to defend, and limited in economic productivity. The loss of Brazil had forced Portugal to focus on consolidation rather than expansion, and the looming presence of industrialized powers highlighted the vulnerability of a small European nation attempting to maintain a global empire. By 1910, Portugal had emerged from the scramble for Africa with its territories legally recognized but inherently fragile, relying on diplomacy, strategic alliances, and selective control. The empire had transitioned from ambition and expansion to survival and maintenance, preparing the stage for the challenges of the 20th century, including authoritarian rule, colonial wars, and eventual decolonization. The 20th century ushered in profound challenges for the Portuguese Empire. Following the instability of the First Republic, 1910 to 1926, political turmoil, economic stagnation, and social unrest created fertile ground for authoritarian rule. By the 1930s, Portugal had entered the Estado Novo, a corporatist dictatorship under António de Oliveira Salazar, which would shape both metropolitan and colonial policy for nearly 4 decades. While Europe moved through industrialization, 2 world wars, and decolonization pressures, Portugal sought to preserve its empire, clinging to its scattered holdings in Africa and Asia through a combination of political repression, economic dependence, and military force. The fall of the monarchy in 1910 had given rise to the Portuguese First Republic, a period characterized by political chaos, frequent changes in government, and economic decline. Social unrest, driven by urbanization, labor strikes, and ideological divisions between monarchists, Republicans, and early communists, left the nation fragmented. Colonial administration suffered from neglect, as Lisbon's attention was divided and resources were scarce. In 1926, a military coup ended the First Republic, ushering in a period of conservative military rule. By 1932, António Salazar, a former finance minister, consolidated power and established the Estado Novo, new state, a corporatist and authoritarian regime emphasizing national unity, Catholic morality, and centralized control. Salazar's policies prioritized economic stability, political order, and imperial preservation, laying the groundwork for the Portuguese approach to colonial governance for decades to come. For Salazar, the empire was not merely symbolic. It was integral to Portugal's survival. The African colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé, were considered essential for economic production, resource extraction, and national prestige. Asian holdings, Goa, Macau, and Timor, were strategic points for maritime trade and diplomatic leverage. The Estado Novo framed the empire as a single, indivisible unit, a narrative designed to unify the nation. Education, propaganda, and administrative rhetoric emphasized Portugal's historical role as a civilizing and Christianizing force, portraying colonial subjects as part of an extended Portuguese family. This ideological framework justified the continuation of authoritarian control over distant territories, even as decolonization movements gained momentum worldwide. While Portugal maintained most of its empire in Africa and Asia, its grip on India faced growing challenges. By the mid-20th century, nationalist sentiment in India had intensified, driven by the broader Indian independence movement and anti-colonial activism. Goa, Daman, and Geo, Portuguese possessions for over 450 years, became focal points of diplomatic tension. Portugal's refusal to negotiate sovereignty, coupled with the rise of Jawaharlal Nehru's post-independence government, created a standoff. In December 1961, India launched Operation Vijay, annexing Goa, Daman, and Geo in a brief but decisive military action. The loss was a major blow to Portugal's imperial prestige. For Salazar, it symbolized the increasing difficulty of maintaining colonial authority in the face of nationalist movements and international pressure, yet it also reinforced the Estado Novo's determination to cling to African territories at all costs. From the early 1960s onward, Portugal faced intense anti-colonial insurgencies in its African territories. These conflicts, collectively known as the Portuguese Colonial Wars, 1961 to 1974, involved guerrilla warfare, ideological battles, and international intervention. Angola witnessed insurgency by the MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, FNLA, National Front for the Liberation of Angola, and UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. Portuguese forces relied on a combination of conventional military units, counterinsurgency tactics, and local auxiliaries to maintain control over urban centers and strategic regions. However, the vast geography, limited manpower, and guerrilla tactics of insurgents created a protracted conflict with heavy casualties. Mozambique faced rebellion from Frelimo, Mozambican Liberation Front, which pursued guerrilla warfare and rural mobilization, targeting colonial infrastructure and Portuguese forces. Portuguese military responses included scorched earth policies, fortified villages, and extensive military campaigns. Yet insurgent resilience prolonged the conflict and drained Lisbon's resources. Guinea-Bissau, a smaller colony, experienced the PAIGC, African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, rebellion. The PAIGC, under Amilcar Cabral, effectively combined guerrilla tactics, political mobilization, and international support to challenge Portuguese authority. The success of the movement in mobilizing rural populations and sustaining long-term resistance posed an existential threat to Portugal's ability to maintain the colony. The colonial wars were immensely costly. Portugal, a nation with limited industrial capacity and a small population, struggled to finance protracted conflicts in multiple theaters. Military expenditures consumed a significant portion of national income, while European allies offered limited support, often critical of Portugal's refusal to decolonize in accordance with global trends. Portugal's insistence on retaining its colonies increasingly isolated it diplomatically. The United Nations, influenced by newly independent African and Asian nations, condemned Portuguese colonialism, labeling it anachronistic and oppressive. Sanctions, embargoes, and international pressure grew, further constraining Portugal's economy and amplifying domestic discontent. The colonial wars had profound social consequences. Military conscription drew young Portuguese men from across the country into overseas combat, exposing them to brutal conditions and guerrilla warfare. Casualties, psychological trauma, and the visible cost of empire sparked public dissatisfaction, particularly in urban centers. Civil society, students, intellectuals, and workers increasingly criticized the Estado Novo, linking domestic authoritarianism to the continuation of costly and morally contentious colonial wars. Cultural resistance, protests, and clandestine opposition movements emerged, laying the foundation for political transformation in the 1970s. The Estado Novo justified its colonial policies through the concept of lusotropicalism, articulated by Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire and promoted in Portuguese discourse. Lusotropicalism posited that Portuguese colonialism was more benign than other European powers, emphasizing cultural assimilation, racial mixing, and civilizational contribution. While this ideology provided propaganda value, the reality of forced labor, guerrilla suppression, and economic exploitation contradicted its principles. Nonetheless, it shaped both metropolitan perception and policy, reinforcing Portugal's determination to maintain its empire despite mounting costs. The Estado Novo and the colonial wars left a complex legacy. On one hand, Portugal maintained its global presence far longer than many other European powers with similarly small populations and resources. The regime projected authority, administered territories, and delayed decolonization amid the rise of anti-colonial movements. On the other hand, the wars imposed immense human and economic costs, entrenched authoritarianism, and isolated Portugal internationally. The ideological justifications of Lusotropicalism masked systemic violence and exploitation, while the loss of Goa and the protracted African conflicts highlighted the limits of maintaining a small empire in a modern, post-colonial world. The period also set the stage for Macau's eventual return in 1999, as Portugal's Asian holdings became the last vestiges of its once global empire. The combination of dictatorship, protracted warfare, and eventual democratic transition illustrates the complex interplay of power, ideology, and survival that characterized the final decades of the Portuguese imperial experience. By 1974, Portugal had transitioned from a centuries-old colonial power into a modern European nation confronting the realities of decolonization. The empire persisted only in Asia, while the African territories embarked on paths of self-determination. The Carnation Revolution was both the culmination of internal pressures and the turning point that finally ended decades of authoritarian persistence in defense of a fading empire. The mid-1970s marked the final chapter of the Portuguese Empire, a period defined by rapid decolonization, geopolitical realignment, and the retreat of European influence in Africa and Asia. With the Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974, Portugal's authoritarian Estado Novo regime collapsed, ushering in a democratic government intent on ending the protracted and costly colonial wars. This new era of transition fundamentally altered the Portuguese Empire, reducing it to a shadow of its former expanse, leaving only a few Asian enclaves as the final vestiges of centuries of maritime dominance. The Carnation Revolution was remarkable for its peaceful nature, symbolized by soldiers placing carnations in their rifles. It was led primarily by the Movimento das Forças Armadas, MFA, a group of mid-level military officers disillusioned by the prolonged African conflicts and the authoritarian regime. Portugal's new leadership quickly recognized that maintaining colonial authority in Africa was both economically untenable and politically indefensible. By 1975, Portugal initiated a series of negotiated independence processes with its African colonies. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe gained sovereignty within months, ending decades of colonial wars, international isolation, and domestic strain. This period of rapid decolonization marked the abrupt end of Portugal's African empire, which had been central to its economy and identity for centuries. Angola, the largest Portuguese colony in Africa, had been embroiled in a civil conflict for over a decade. Three major nationalist movements, the MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, FNLA, National Front for the Liberation of Angola, and UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, had vied for dominance, supported by Cold War powers. Portuguese withdrawal left a power vacuum that quickly escalated into civil war. The MPLA, supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba, eventually seized Luanda and declared the People's Republic of Angola in November 1975. FNLA and UNITA, backed by the United States, Zaire, and South Africa, continued to contest control, igniting a conflict that would last decades. For Portugal, Angola's independence represented the loss of the empire's most resource-rich African possession, ending centuries of extraction, administration, and strategic influence in southern Africa. Economically, Angola had been a key source of minerals, coffee, and agricultural exports, while politically, it had served as a cornerstone of imperial legitimacy. Mozambique followed a similar trajectory. The Frelimo Mozambican Liberation Front, which had waged a successful guerrilla campaign against Portuguese forces, negotiated the transfer of power. Independence was officially declared on June 25, 1975, with Samora Machel as the first president. Mozambique's departure from Portuguese control was relatively peaceful compared to Angola, though the new state immediately faced challenges, including reconstruction, refugee crises, and regional instability. Portuguese settlers and administrators were repatriated, marking the end of centuries of direct European presence. The economy transitioned from colonial extraction to socialist central planning, illustrating the transformative impact of decolonization on both the former colony and Portugal itself. In Guinea-Bissau, independence had already been partially recognized in 1973 following a successful PEG campaign. Portugal formalized sovereignty in September 1974, completing a negotiated settlement. Cape Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe, smaller and less contested territories, achieved independence later in 1975. These transitions were largely peaceful, but they signified the complete dissolution of Portuguese authority in Africa, ending centuries of trade networks, forts, and colonial administration across the continent. After the African decolonization, Portugal retained only a few Asian territories. Goa had already been lost to India in 1961, leaving Macau and East Timor as the final remnants of the empire. Macau, a strategic port on the southern coast of China, remained under Portuguese administration. While small in population and territory, Macau held cultural, economic, and symbolic significance. It had long been a hub for trade between Europe and Asia, facilitating the flow of silk, tea, porcelain, and other commodities. Macau's governance in this period required careful diplomacy with the People's Republic of China, balancing Portuguese sovereignty with Chinese ambitions. East Timor, in Southeast Asia, also remained a Portuguese possession. Isolated and underdeveloped, the territory served as a vestige of Portugal's once global reach. Its administration was limited, with small Portuguese military and civil presences maintaining authority. The island's remoteness and strategic marginality meant that Portugal could sustain control without the same level of pressure seen in Africa. Negotiations over Macau's future began in earnest in the late 20th century. Portugal recognized the growing geopolitical influence of China and the impossibility of retaining Macau indefinitely. By 1987, Portugal and China signed the Sino-Portuguese Joint Declaration, agreeing that Macau would return to Chinese sovereignty under the one country, two systems framework, allowing the territory a high degree of autonomy post-handover. The final transfer occurred on December 20th, 1999, marking the end of 584 years of the Portuguese overseas empire. Crowds gathered to witness the lowering of the Portuguese flag for the last time. The handover represented both an emotional and historical conclusion, closing a chapter that had begun with the capture of Ceuta in 1415 and had spanned continents, oceans, and centuries. Even as the empire dissolved, Portugal's historical influence persisted. The Portuguese language continued to be spoken across Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and Macau, forming a linguistic and cultural network connecting former colonies. Portuguese legal systems, educational institutions, religious traditions, and architecture left enduring marks in Africa, Asia, and South America. Former colonies retained cultural and economic links to Portugal, maintaining trade, diplomatic ties, and shared historical narratives. The empire's influence was not merely territorial. It had shaped global patterns of commerce, culture, and geopolitics in ways that endured long after sovereignty was relinquished. The end of the empire forced Portugal to redefine its national identity and economy. The country shifted focus from overseas administration to European integration, modernization, and domestic development. The democratic government undertook economic reforms, educational expansion, and infrastructure modernization, gradually aligning Portugal with broader European norms. The return of Macau in 1999 symbolized the conclusion of Portugal's maritime imperial epoch, but it also marked the beginning of a new global posture, rooted in diplomacy, trade, and cultural influence rather than territorial control. Portugal's evolution from a global maritime power to a modern European state illustrates the broader story of imperial rise, maintenance, and eventual decolonization. The period from 1975 to 1999 represents the final unraveling of an empire that had lasted nearly 6 centuries. Portugal's retreat from Africa, the retention of only Asian enclaves, and the eventual handover of Macau reflect both historical inevitability and strategic adaptation. Unlike other European empires that dissolved through gradual decline, Portugal's decolonization was abrupt, accelerated by political revolution, global anti-colonial movements, and economic necessity. Yet even in its final years, the empire remained symbolically potent. The persistence of Macau and East Timor reminded the world of Portugal's historical reach, its maritime legacy, and its centuries-long role in connecting continents. The empire's conclusion was not a failure, but the culmination of centuries of adaptation, resilience, and transformation. By December 20th, 1999, the Portuguese Empire had officially ended. Macau, the final outpost, was returned to China, closing a story that had spanned 584 years, 6 centuries in which Portugal had transformed from a small Iberian kingdom into the architect of the first global empire. The journey from Ceuta to Macau, from Brazil to Goa, from the African coast to the Spice Islands, reflects a complex narrative of exploration, conquest, trade, culture, and adaptation. The Portuguese Empire's legacy endures not in territory, but in language, culture, legal systems, and global connections. The empire had pioneered maritime exploration, connected distant continents, and influenced global trade patterns. Its story is a testament to both the possibilities and limitations of imperial ambition, demonstrating how a small European nation once held vast oceans in its grasp and how, over centuries, the tides of history reshaped the world.